The Boeing 777's engines hummed their monotonous lullaby 37,000 feet above the Pacific, but something was wrong. Passengers in first class barely looked up from their champagne flutes when Captain Morrison's voice crackled through the intercom, steady but strained. Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing a technical situation. If there are any licensed pilots aboard, please identify yourselves to the flight crew immediately. In row 11 of business class, billionaire tech mogul Valencia Reyes didn't even open her eyes. Her Hermes eye mask remained perfectly positioned, noise-canceling headphones still playing Vivaldi's Four Seasons. The woman who'd revolutionized quantum computing and built a $30 billion empire from her MIT dorm room had learned to sleep through turbulence, both literal and metaphorical. But the frantic whispers spreading through the cabin gradually penetrated her cocoon of engineered silence. "Both pilots are down," a flight attendant whispered urgently to her colleague near Valencia's row. "Food poisoning from that seafood in Hong Kong. Captain Morrison can barely keep his eyes open, and First Officer Kim just passed out." Valencia's manicured fingers slowly reached up to lift her eye mask. Her sharp amber eyes, the same ones that had stared down hostile board rooms and congressional hearings, took in the controlled chaos around her. Flight attendants moved with practiced efficiency, but she caught the micro-expressions of barely contained panic. 20 years ago, she'd been Lieutenant Valencia Viper Reyes, flying F-16 Fighting Falcons over Iraq and Afghanistan. Before the tech fortune, before the magazine covers calling her the most dangerous woman in Silicon Valley, before she'd become synonymous with innovation and ruthless business acumen, she'd been a pilot. Not just any pilot, one of the Air Force's finest, with over 2,000 flight hours in combat zones. But that was a lifetime ago. A carefully buried lifetime that didn't fit the narrative her publicists preferred. The media loved their story. Brilliant computer scientist becomes overnight sensation, drops out of MIT to change the world. They didn't need to know about the years she'd spent dodging surface-to-air missiles over Fallujah or the distinguished flying cross gathering dust in her Malibu mansion safe. Now, as she watched a young mother across the aisle clutch her sleeping toddler with white knuckles, Valencia felt something stir that had nothing to do with quarterly earnings or stock prices. The captain's voice returned, more desperate now. "I repeat, if anyone has commercial or military flight experience, we need your assistance immediately. We are currently maintaining altitude, but I need backup. Lives depend on it." Valencia Reyes slowly removed her headphones, her mind already calculating airspeed, fuel consumption, and the complex dance of keeping 300 souls aloft in an aluminum tube hurtling through the darkness at 500 miles per hour. Captain Morrison stumbled slightly as he gripped the cockpit doorframe, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool cabin air. His 23 years of commercial aviation experience felt worthless now as waves of nausea crashed over him. First Officer Kim had already succumbed, slumped in his seat with an oxygen mask over his pale face. The autopilot held their course, but Morrison knew his deteriorating condition left them maybe 30 minutes before he'd be completely incapacitated. "Sir," flight attendant Jessica Park appeared at his shoulder, her normally pristine appearance showing signs of stress. "We have someone." Morrison's vision swam as he turned. Behind Jessica stood a woman in expensive casual wear, designer jeans, silk blouse, jewelry that probably cost more than his annual salary. She looked like another privileged passenger, the type who complained about champagne temperature and demanded upgrades. "Ma'am, I asked for qualified pilots," Morrison managed, fighting another wave of nausea. "Lieutenant Valencia Reyes, United States Air Force, retired," she said crisply, her voice carrying an unmistakable command authority that cut through his illness-induced fog. "Multi-engine rated, 2,000 flight hours, including combat missions over Iraq and Afghanistan. F-16 Falcon primary, but I've logged time in everything from cargo transports to trainers." Morrison blinked hard, trying to process. This woman, This obviously wealthy civilian was claiming military aviation credentials. "I need to see identification." Valencia was already reaching into her purse, producing a worn leather wallet. Her military ID was expired but authentic, the photo showing a younger woman in Air Force dress blues. More importantly, she handed him a current civilian pilot's license with commercial ratings. "Jesus," Morrison breathed, studying the documentation. "Why didn't you speak up immediately?" "Because 20 years ago, when I told people I was a pilot, they'd ask if I flew for the airlines," Valencia replied evenly. "When I said fighter jets, they'd assume I was lying or exaggerating. I learned to let others volunteer first." She paused, watching his deteriorating condition. "But since nobody else did, and you look like you're about to join your co-pilot in unconsciousness, I suppose I should mention I also have Boeing 777 type rating. Got it 5 years ago, when I was considering purchasing a private fleet." Morrison's knees nearly buckled with relief. "Can you handle approach and landing?" "Captain, I once landed a damaged F-16 with hydraulic failure on a runway half this length while taking enemy fire," Valencia said, already moving toward the co-pilot's seat. "I think I can manage bringing your passengers home safely." As she settled into the familiar embrace of an aircraft cockpit, Valencia felt muscle memory flooding back. Her hands moved instinctively across the instrument panel, reading displays, checking systems. The Boeing's cockpit was vastly different from an F-16's cramped fighter environment, but the fundamentals remained: altitude, airspeed, navigation, communication. "Tower, this is United 847, she transmitted, her voice steady and professional, already assuming control of a situation spiraling toward disaster. The radio crackled with confusion from air traffic control. "United 847, we show Captain Morrison as pilot in command. Please confirm." "Tower, this is Valencia Reyes, emergency backup pilot now assuming primary flight controls due to crew incapacitation. Requesting priority routing to nearest suitable airport and emergency services on standby." Her fingers danced across the flight management system, calculating fuel, distance, and approach options with the precision of someone who'd made life-and-death decisions in far more chaotic circumstances. Behind her, Captain Morrison had collapsed into a passenger seat, finally allowing the food poisoning to claim him. But for the first time in hours, he felt a strange peace. The woman now flying his aircraft moved with the controlled confidence of someone born to command the sky. Valencia's amber eyes scanned the horizon ahead, reading weather patterns and calculating wind speeds the way others read stock reports. The Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly below, indifferent to the drama playing out 7 miles above its surface. But she'd flown above hostile deserts where death waited at every altitude. This was just another mission. The difference was the stakes. 300 civilians trusted her now, including a tech mogul's worst nightmare, depending entirely on skills she'd spent decades trying to forget. 300 miles behind them, the lights of Honolulu's airport grew brighter as Valencia adjusted their heading. She'd spent the last 2 hours walking passengers through emergency procedures, her voice carrying the calm authority that had once briefed pilots before combat missions. The cabin had transformed from barely controlled panic to focused preparation, passengers responding to leadership they sensed rather than understood. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your pilot speaking." Valencia's announcement drew immediate attention. She'd moved beyond formal introductions. These people needed to know exactly who held their lives in her hands. "My name is Valencia Reyes. Before I built quantum computers, I flew fighter jets for the United States Air Force. I've landed aircraft in sandstorms, under fire, and with multiple system failures. Tonight presents none of those challenges." A murmur rippled through the cabin. Some passengers recognized her name from business magazines, others from technology conferences. But hearing "fighter pilot" recontextualized everything they thought they knew about the woman who'd volunteered to save their lives. We're approaching Honolulu International Airport with perfect weather conditions and full system functionality, Valencia continued. Emergency services are positioned as a precaution, but this will be a routine landing. I need everyone secured in your seats, seat backs upright, and trust that I've done this before. In the cockpit, she established communication with ground control, her radio discipline flawless despite the 20-year gap since active duty. Honolulu Tower, United 847 requesting straighten approach runway 8 left. Emergency services requested for crew medical situation, not aircraft emergency. United 847, Honolulu Tower, cleared straighten approach runway 8 left. Emergency vehicles standing by. Are you declaring emergency status? Valencia considered. Captain Morrison and First Officer Kim were stable but incapacitated. All aircraft systems showed green. Her own skills, despite the years, felt sharp as ever. Negative emergency declaration. Precautionary only. United 847 has situation under control. The approach lights appeared ahead, a string of pearls guiding them home. Valencia's hands moved with practiced precision, adjusting throttles, configuring flaps, calling out airspeed and altitude checks to herself. The muscle memory was perfect. 20 years dissolved into nothing as she became Lieutenant Viper Rays again, bringing her aircraft and crew home safe. Landing gear down and locked, she announced to the cabin. 2 minutes to touchdown. Below, emergency vehicles lined the runway, their flashing lights creating a light show that would have seemed ominous under different circumstances. But Valencia saw them as what they were, professionals doing their job, ready for contingencies but probably unnecessary. The runway rose to meet them, and Valencia executed a landing so smooth that passengers applauded before they realized they were safely on the ground. As the Boeing rolled to a stop, surrounded by emergency vehicles and ground crews, she finally allowed herself a small smile. "Welcome to Honolulu," she announced. "Thank you for flying with us tonight." The emergency vehicles surrounded United 847 like mechanical vultures, but their urgency proved unnecessary. Captain Morrison and First Officer Kim were conscious but weak, helped off the aircraft by paramedics who found them stable and responsive. The food poisoning that had nearly caused catastrophe was already responding to treatment. Valencia remained in the cockpit, completing post-flight procedures with the methodical precision of someone who understood that missions ended properly or they didn't end at all. She filled out incident reports, coordinated with airport authorities, and ensured every regulatory requirement was satisfied before finally gathering her personal items. As she prepared to leave, Captain Morrison appeared in the cockpit doorway, still pale but determined to speak. "Ms. Reyes, I need to say something." Valencia looked up from her paperwork, eyebrows raised. 23 years I've been flying commercially," Morrison continued. "I've seen good pilots and great pilots. What you did tonight, taking control of an unfamiliar aircraft, managing passenger psychology, executing a perfect approach in emergency conditions, that's the finest display of airmanship I've ever witnessed." "I was just returning to my seat in business class, Captain. You would have done the same." Morrison shook his head. "No, I wouldn't have, because I couldn't have. You saved 300 lives tonight, including mine. But more than that, you reminded me why I fell in love with flying in the first place." He paused, studying her face. "Why did you leave the Air Force? With skills like yours, you could have flown anything they had." Valencia's expression grew distant. "Because combat flying is young person's work, Captain, and because sometimes you reach a point where you've proven everything you need to prove to everyone except yourself." She shouldered her purse, movements crisp despite the emotional weight of the conversation. "I had other battles to fight." As they walked down the jet bridge together, Morrison noticed something he'd missed earlier. Valencia moved with the precise, economical stride of someone accustomed to military bearing, her situational awareness constantly cataloging exits, people, potential threats. Even in civilian clothes, she carried herself like an officer. "The passengers want to thank you," he mentioned. "That's unnecessary. I was just doing what needed to be done." But as they entered the terminal, 300 grateful passengers and their families created an impromptu receiving line. Children pressed drawings into her hands. Business travelers offered contact cards and investment opportunities. Elderly passengers simply touched her arm and whispered, "Thank you." Valencia accepted each gesture with grace, but Morrison could see the discomfort in her eyes. This wasn't the anonymous wealth she was accustomed to. This was personal recognition for saving lives, not building companies. Near the baggage claim, a young girl broke free from her mother's grip and ran to Valencia. "Are you really a fighter pilot?" Valencia knelt to the child's eye level. "I was a long time ago." "Will you teach me to fly?" "Someday, when you're older, maybe you'll teach me something new about flying." Later that evening, in her suite at the Royal Hawaiian Hotel, Valencia stood on her balcony overlooking Waikiki Beach. The Pacific stretched endlessly before her, the same ocean she'd crossed at 37,000 feet just hours earlier. Her phone buzzed constantly with interview requests, speaking opportunities and business propositions, but she'd turned it off. For the first time in 20 years, she wasn't thinking about quarterly projections or board meetings. She was remembering the feeling of an aircraft responding to her touch, the trust of passengers depending on her skill, the satisfaction of bringing everyone home safely. The woman who'd conquered Silicon Valley had rediscovered something she'd forgotten in the pursuit of billions: the pure joy of being exactly who she was meant to be. The next morning brought media attention that Valencia's publicists couldn't control or spin. Billionaire tech CEO saves 300 lives in emergency landing, dominated headlines across every major news outlet. But the story went deeper than typical business press coverage. This was about a hidden military background that recontextualized everything the public thought they knew about Valencia Reyes. CNN aired archived footage of her Air Force commendation ceremonies. The New York Times interviewed former squadron mates who described Lieutenant Viper Reyes as fearless, precise, and uncompromising in her standards. Forbes ran a cover story titled "The Fighter Pilot CEO: How Military Training Built a Business Empire." Valencia watched the coverage from her hotel room with mixed emotions. She'd spent 2 decades carefully crafting a public image focused on innovation and entrepreneurship. The military service was something she'd mentioned in passing during interviews, usually dismissed as irrelevant background noise by journalists more interested in her rise from MIT dropout to tech mogul. Now, suddenly, everyone wanted to understand how fighter pilot training had shaped her business philosophy. How did military precision translate to corporate leadership? What combat lessons applied to boardroom battles? Had her aviation background influenced her approach to risk management and strategic planning? "The irony is perfect," she murmured to herself, while reading analysis pieces that dissected her career through this new lens. Business schools would probably create case studies examining the connections between military aviation and successful entrepreneurship. Her phone rang. Rachel Martinez, her longtime publicist and crisis management specialist. "Valencia, we need to discuss media strategy," Rachel began without preamble. "Every major network wants exclusive interviews. Harvard Business Review wants to run a cover feature. The Pentagon is offering you a civilian service award. This is unprecedented positive coverage, but we need to control the narrative." "What narrative?" Valencia asked, genuinely curious about her publicist's perspective. "The hero narrative, the hidden military background, the dramatic rescue. We can leverage this into massive brand enhancement, speaking opportunities, maybe even a book deal. But we need to get ahead of any potential negative stories about why you left military service." Valencia was quiet for a long moment. Through her hotel window, she could see families on Waikiki Beach, children building sandcastles while their parents relaxed in the Hawaiian sun. Normal people living normal lives, not calculating brand enhancement or narrative control. Rachel, I want to ask you something. Do you think saving 300 lives was a good business decision? Well, obviously it generated incredible positive publicity. That's not what I asked. Her publicist paused, confused by the question's directness. I don't understand. Never mind. Schedule whatever interviews make sense, but I'm not doing a book deal or speaking tour about this. Some things don't need to be monetized. After ending the call, Valencia realized something fundamental had shifted in her perspective. For 20 years, she'd approached every situation through the lens of strategic advantage and competitive positioning. Last night, for the first time since leaving the military, she'd acted purely on instinct and duty rather than calculated benefit. The woman who'd built an empire by turning every interaction into opportunity had rediscovered the satisfaction of helping others with no expectation of return. The CNN interview aired 3 days later, conducted by veteran journalist Anderson Cooper in Valencia's Malibu office. She'd chosen the setting deliberately, surrounded by quantum computing prototypes and business awards rather than military memorabilia. But Cooper's first question cut straight to the contradiction everyone wanted addressed. Ms. Reyes, you've built one of the most successful technology companies in the world, but until this week, very few people knew about your military background. Why keep that service hidden? Valencia had anticipated this question but still took a moment before responding. I wouldn't say hidden, Anderson. It's mentioned in my official biography, listed on my company's website. But when you're a woman in technology, people already question your technical credentials. Adding former fighter pilot often makes them assume you're compensating for something or exaggerating your qualifications. But your military record is extraordinary. Distinguished Flying Cross, 2 combat action medals, over 2,000 flight hours including combat missions. Why not leverage that credibility? Because the moment I mention flying F-16s in combat zones, the conversation shifts from my company's quantum computing breakthroughs to whether women should serve in combat roles. I built Ray's Industries to advance technological innovation, not relitigate political debates about military service. Cooper leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. But surely that military training influenced your business leadership style. Valencia nodded slowly. Military aviation teaches you that preparation and precision prevent catastrophic failure. In combat flying, there's no margin for error. You either execute perfectly or people die. That mindset definitely carries over into business strategy and team management. Speaking of execution, let's talk about United Flight 847. Walk me through your decision-making process when you heard the captain's call for volunteer pilots. For the first time during the interview, Valencia's carefully composed expression softened slightly. I heard a man desperately trying to save 300 lives, including his own. Everything else, my business reputation, personal comfort, media coverage, became irrelevant. There were people in danger and I had skills that could help. The decision was automatic. Automatic. Military training creates certain reflexive responses, Anderson. When people need help and you're qualified to provide it, you act. You don't calculate potential consequences or worry about public relations implications. You just do what needs to be done. Cooper smiled. That sounds like the opposite of typical CEO decision-making, which involves extensive analysis and risk assessment. Maybe that's the problem with how we approach business leadership, Valencia replied. Sometimes the right decision is obvious and overthinking creates paralysis. On Flight 847, 300 people needed a pilot. I was a pilot. Everything else was just details. The interview continued for another 20 minutes, but that exchange, Valencia's matter-of-fact explanation of duty over calculation, became the most widely quoted portion. Business schools began incorporating military leadership principles into their curricula, using Valencia as a case study in values-based decision-making. 3 weeks after the emergency landing, Valencia received an unexpected visitor at her corporate headquarters in Silicon Valley. Master Sergeant Elena Rodriguez, now retired but still carrying herself with unmistakable military bearing, had flown from Colorado Springs specifically to meet with her former squadron mate. "Lieutenant Reyes," Rodriguez said with a slight smile, using Valencia's old rank despite 20 years of separation. "Elena Rodriguez," Valencia replied warmly, embracing her former crew chief. "I haven't seen you since my last deployment. What brings you to California?" Actually. I saw the news coverage about the emergency landing, and I wanted to tell you something important." Rodriguez's expression grew serious. "Do you remember Captain Jennifer Phoenix Martinez?" Valencia's face clouded slightly. "Of course. She was killed in action over Fallujah in 2004. IED attack on the base perimeter while she was conducting pre-flight inspections." "Right. What you might not know is that her daughter, Maria, is now 22 years old and just graduated from the Air Force Academy. She's been accepted into pilot training, specifically requesting fighter aircraft assignment." "That's wonderful news. Jennifer would be proud." Rodriguez reached into her briefcase, extracting a worn photograph and a folded letter. "Maria asked me to give you these. The photo is from her commissioning ceremony. She wore her mother's wings. The letter explains why she chose aviation." Valencia opened the letter carefully, her hands trembling slightly as she read Maria Martinez's precise handwriting. "Ms. Reyes, you probably don't remember me, but you visited our family after my mother's funeral in 2004. I was 7 years old, and you knelt down to my eye level and told me that my mother died serving something bigger than herself. You said that someday, when I was old enough, I might choose to serve too. You gave me one of your squadron patches and said it represented the best of what people could be when they worked together. I kept that patch through elementary school, middle school, high school, and 4 years at the academy. It reminded me that service wasn't about politics or glory. It was about having skills that could help others and the courage to use them. When I saw the news about Flight 847, I recognized something familiar in your actions. You didn't save those passengers because it was good for your business or your reputation. You saved them because someone needed help and you could provide it. That's the same reason my mother flew combat missions, and it's the same reason I'm becoming a pilot. Thank you for showing me that service takes many forms, but the motivation should always be the same." Valencia read the letter twice, her eyes moist by the end. The photograph showed a young woman in Air Force dress blues, wearing pilot's wings and carrying herself with the confident bearing of someone raised to understand duty and sacrifice. "She looks exactly like Jennifer," Valencia whispered. "Acts like her too," Rodriguez replied. "Determined, fearless, and absolutely committed to excellence. She starts pilot training next month at Columbus Air Force Base." Valencia stared at the photograph, seeing not just Maria Martinez, but a reflection of her own younger self, eager to prove herself, convinced that military service represented the highest form of contribution to society. Before corporate boards and billion-dollar valuations, before magazine covers and technology conferences, she'd been motivated by the same simple principle Maria had articulated: having skills that could help others and the courage to use them. "Elena, I want to ask you something," Valencia said quietly. "Do you think I made the right choice, leaving the Air Force, building a company, focusing on business instead of service?" Rodriguez considered the question carefully. "Lieutenant, you've employed thousands of people, advanced technology that benefits millions, And last month you saved 300 lives using skills the Air Force taught you. Service takes different forms, but it's always about using your abilities to make things better for other people. Valencia nodded slowly, understanding something about herself that had taken 20 years to crystallize. 2 months later, Valencia announced the establishment of the Martinez Foundation for Military Aviation, a scholarship program supporting children of fallen service members pursuing careers in aviation and aerospace technology. The foundation's first recipient was Second Lieutenant Maria Martinez, beginning her pilot training with full support for advanced education in aeronautical engineering. But Valencia's most significant decision came during a private meeting with the Pentagon's civilian leadership. Secretary of Defense Patricia Williams had requested the meeting to discuss potential consulting opportunities, expecting Valencia to leverage her emergency landing heroics into lucrative defense contracts. Instead, Valencia proposed something entirely different. Madam Secretary, I want to discuss a personnel challenge the Air Force faces with experienced pilots leaving military service for civilian careers. Secretary Williams nodded. Retention is a constant issue. Commercial airlines and private companies offer significantly higher compensation packages. What if we approached the problem differently? Instead of competing with civilian salaries, what if we created pathways for experienced military aviators to maintain their service commitment while pursuing other careers? Valencia outlined her proposal, a reserve program allowing former military pilots to maintain their qualifications and serve part-time while building civilian careers. Participants would commit to emergency response duties, training responsibilities, and periodic active service, maintaining military benefits while pursuing entrepreneurship, corporate leadership, or other professional goals. The program would retain experienced pilots, provide military aviation with mature leadership, and demonstrate that service doesn't have to end when someone leaves active duty, Valencia explained. I'd be willing to serve as a pilot program participant. Secretary Williams was intrigued. You're proposing to return to military service. I'm proposing to acknowledge that I never really left. Military training shaped everything I've accomplished in civilian life. It's time to make that connection official again. 3 months later, Colonel Valencia Reyes, Reserves, reported for her first weekend drill at Travis Air Force Base, flying C-17 transport aircraft on humanitarian missions and training exercises. The media coverage was extensive but different from her previous business-focused interviews. This time, reporters struggled to understand why a billionaire would voluntarily return to military service without compensation or personal benefit. Valencia's answer was simple. Some people collect art or vintage cars. I collect opportunities to serve others. Flying military aircraft for humanitarian missions is just another way to use the skills I've developed for something bigger than quarterly earnings. The woman who'd once hidden her military background now wore her Air Force uniform with the same pride she'd carried as a young lieutenant. But now, she understood something that had taken 20 years to learn. True success wasn't about choosing between service and achievement. It was about finding ways to serve through achievement. Standing on the flight line at Travis Air Force Base, watching young airmen prepare aircraft for their next mission, Valencia realized her journey had come full circle. She'd left the military to prove herself in the civilian world, built an empire to demonstrate her capabilities, and ultimately discovered that her greatest satisfaction came from using those capabilities in service of others. The billionaire in row 11 had awakened to remember she'd always been Lieutenant Viper Reyes. The emergency landing wasn't just about saving 300 passengers. It was about remembering who she'd always been beneath the corporate titles and business achievements. 6 months after United Flight 847's emergency landing, Valencia received a letter that would fundamentally change her understanding of leadership and legacy. The envelope bore the seal of the White House, but the contents were unexpected. Not an invitation to a ceremony or policy discussion, but a personal note from President Elizabeth Chen. Ms. Reyes, I wanted to thank you personally for your service, both past and present. Your actions on Flight 847 exemplify the best of American values: competence, courage, and commitment to others. However, I'm writing about something more significant than a single emergency landing. Your decision to return to military service while maintaining your business leadership has sparked a national conversation about civic duty and professional responsibility. Young people across the country are asking whether success requires choosing between personal achievement and public service, or whether the most meaningful careers integrate both. I believe you've provided a powerful answer to that question. Would you consider serving on a national commission examining how we can better prepare future leaders to see business success and public service as complementary rather than competing objectives? Valencia set the letter down, considering its implications. The president was asking her to help redefine how Americans thought about success, service, and social responsibility. But more importantly, she was being asked to help young people avoid the false choice she'd wrestled with for 20 years. That afternoon, she called Second Lieutenant Maria Martinez, now halfway through pilot training at Columbus Air Force Base. Maria, this is Colonel Reyes. How's flight training progressing? Excellently, ma'am. I'm consistently ranked in the top 5% of my class, and my instructor pilots say I have natural feel for tactical flying. Outstanding. I'm calling because I want to ask you something important. When you complete pilot training and begin your military career, do you plan to serve 20 years and then transition to civilian life? Maria paused, clearly considering the question carefully. Ma'am, I'd plan to serve my initial commitment and then evaluate options. Why do you ask? Because I spent 20 years believing I had to choose between military service and business success. I was wrong. The most effective leaders find ways to integrate service into whatever career they pursue. You don't have to choose between flying military aircraft and building companies, between serving your country and achieving financial success. I'm not sure I understand, ma'am. Valencia smiled, remembering her own confusion at that age about life's possibilities. Maria, your mother died serving something bigger than herself, but service doesn't end when you take off the uniform. It evolves into different forms of contribution and leadership. The skills military aviation teaches: precision, decision-making under pressure, responsibility for others' lives. These translate into any career you choose. Are you suggesting I shouldn't make the Air Force my career? I'm suggesting you should make service your career, whether that's 20 years in uniform or 10 years active duty followed by reserve service while you build businesses, run for political office, lead educational institutions, or pursue any other goals. The key is maintaining the service mindset regardless of your job title. Maria was quiet for a moment. Colonel, may I ask you something personal? Of course. Do you regret leaving active duty when you did? Valencia considered the question, thinking about her journey from Lieutenant Viper, raised to billionaire CEO to reserve colonel. Maria, I regret thinking I had to choose between different ways of serving, but I don't regret any specific decision, because each step taught me something essential about leadership and responsibility. What did building a business teach you that military service hadn't? That civilian leadership often lacks the mission focus and team commitment that military service instills. Business schools teach strategy and management, but military service teaches you that leadership means being personally responsible for other people's welfare and success. After ending the call, Valencia realized that her conversation with Maria had clarified her own thinking about the president's commission invitation. She wasn't being asked to serve because of her business success or military background separately. She was being asked because she demonstrated that integrating both created more effective leadership. That evening, she drafted her acceptance letter to President Chen, agreeing to chair the National Commission on Service and Leadership. The first meeting of the National Commission on Service and Leadership convened in Washington 6 weeks later, bringing together business leaders, military officers, educators, and policymakers to address a fundamental question. How could America better prepare young leaders to see success and service as mutually reinforcing rather than competing objectives? Valencia arrived early to the old executive office building conference room, reviewing materials and preparing for discussions that would influence educational policy, military personnel programs, and business leadership development for decades. She'd invited specific commission members based on their ability to bridge traditional divides between military and civilian, public and private, profit and service. General Patricia Storm Washington, the Air Force's first African-American female four-star general, had transitioned to civilian leadership as Chancellor of the University of Virginia. Marcus Chen, former Navy SEAL, had built a successful venture capital firm specializing in veteran-founded companies. Dr. Sarah Running Bear, Army veteran and Rhodes Scholar, now served as Director of Social Innovation at Stanford Business School. "Ladies and gentlemen," Valencia began as the commission convened, "we're here because America faces a leadership crisis that no one wants to acknowledge publicly. We're producing highly educated, technically competent young people who see career success and public service as mutually exclusive choices." She clicked to the first slide of her presentation, showing survey data from recent college graduates. 73% of graduating seniors from top universities say they would consider public service if it didn't require sacrificing financial security or career advancement. 86% believe business leaders have a responsibility to address societal challenges, but only 31% think their own career plans include meaningful service components. General Washington leaned forward. "The military faces the same challenge from a different angle. Our most promising officers often leave active duty not because they're disillusioned with service, but because they believe continued military service prevents them from having broader impact through civilian careers." Marcus Chen nodded. "The veteran entrepreneur community sees this constantly. Highly capable former service members who think they need to choose between mission-focused work and financial success. They don't realize the same leadership principles that made them effective military officers can create both business success and social impact." Dr. Running Bear added, "Business schools compound the problem by treating profit maximization and social responsibility as separate subjects rather than integrated leadership challenges. Students graduate thinking they'll make money first and give back later, instead of building careers that create value and serve society simultaneously." Valencia smiled, recognizing the transformation in her own thinking reflected in their comments. "So our fundamental task is redefining success from either-or to both end, military service and business leadership, financial achievement and social impact, personal success and public service." Over the next 6 months, the Commission developed recommendations that would reshape how America thought about leadership development. Their final report, Integrated Leadership, Serving Through Success, became required reading at military academies, business schools, and policy programs nationwide. But Valencia's most important contribution came in the report's opening essay, where she wrote, "True leadership isn't about choosing between service and success. It's about understanding that the highest forms of success come through service to others, and the most meaningful service often requires the resources and influence that success provides." The Commission's work concluded just as Second Lieutenant Maria Martinez graduated from pilot training, earning assignment to F-35 Lightning II fighters, the same tactical aviation mission her mother had served. At her graduation ceremony, Maria approached Valencia with a question that would define the next phase of both their careers. Colonel, I've been thinking about our conversation regarding service and career choices. What if someone wanted to serve 20 years active duty and simultaneously build a business focused on military innovation? Is that possible? Valencia smiled, recognizing her younger self's ambition tempered by hard-won wisdom about integrating different forms of service. Maria, let me tell you about a concept called simultaneous careers that the Commission developed specifically for people like you. 2 years later, Captain Maria Martinez was flying combat missions in the Pacific while completing an MBA through the Air Force Institute of Technology, developing business plans for military innovation startups. Her thesis project, Integrating Entrepreneurship with Military Service, became the foundation for a new Air Force program, allowing officers to pursue business development while maintaining their service commitments. Valencia served as Maria's thesis advisor and business mentor, helping her understand that the same leadership principles that made her an effective fighter pilot could create business success focused on military and veteran issues. But more importantly, she helped Maria avoid the false choice that had defined Valencia's own career for 20 years. Standing on the flight line at Nelly's Air Force Base, watching Captain Martinez taxi her F-35 after a training mission, Valencia reflected on how dramatically her understanding of success and service had evolved. The emergency landing on United Flight 847 had been just the beginning of remembering who she'd always been beneath.